Okay, looks like we're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Mission Top. Mission Top is a farmstead and ranch. It's a place. It is a family. It is a process of philia sophia, trying to develop a friendship relationship, a friendship love with wisdom. Glad to have all you on here already. A few of you are already talking in the chat. Laurent, Christian, Martin, welcome. Hopefully we can make today a fruitful discussion as we are discussing the 7-day week as a cycle of sacred time. And this kind of emerged just out of the events of the end of this week and the beginning of this week. And so I want to share that with you, kind of the process by which the thought for today's stream came about. On Friday, we were... we had this stream with my wife on and whatnot. We talked about family councils. And at some point that day, I read or watched, I guess you could say, a video essay by the channel Like Stories of Old. It's a channel that I very much recommend. As I'm looking here, I see that Lyra is up here in the room with me today, one of our Huskies. So hopefully she can provide a little entertainment for you there in the background before she takes off. But anyway, back to the story. So I was watching a essay on the channel Like Stories of Old, which is a channel I highly recommend. I think in a lot of ways very much in line with what I'm doing, especially as I'm getting more into focusing on movies and whatnot, as he does. It's one that I've watched for a few years. As with everything, I like a tremendous amount of what he does. There's other kind of approaches that he does that I don't quite agree with, but always interesting, and I always enjoy his channel. So I recommend that. So he had this essay that came out just a few days ago, which is entitled "Why You Keep Returning to Skyrim: Story Worlds as Sacred Spaces." And even though I don't play a lot of video games, the concept of sacred spaces and just knowing what video games are like and the immersion of them, the title just kind of grabbed me in, and I watched the entire thing. Very good essay. And by the way, the world of Skyrim, as it's there, again, I've never played the game, but as the visuals that are in that essay, that really shows kind of the world that I would love to build, that I would love to see the world exist like. A world of natural beauty, a world of beautiful structures, a world of warm fires to counter kind of the cold Nordic atmosphere that's in there. You'll have to check it out to see exactly what I mean, but that just is one more illustration, such as the other examples that I bring up of the Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, of the kind of world we could build still, and even keep technology and everything, but just put everything so that we, instead of having power lines, ugly power lines out there that would never, you'd never have power lines around Hogwarts, and you'd never have it in Lord of the Rings, and in a beautiful world, you should not have power lines hanging out over things as well. But that doesn't mean you can't have electricity still done in the right way. So anyway, Skyrim I present as another version of how the world could be built by us. It is a possibility. But anyway, so I enjoyed that, as well as his commentary on sacred spaces. And in the course of that essay, he brought up this book, which is called The Sacred and the Profane: The Nature of Religion, by Mircea Eliade. And as he brought that up, I realized, and was quoting from it, I was very much enjoying the quotations, I realized, I already have this book, because I have a bad habit of ordering far too many books, because I just love books. I mean, the insights that come from them, the experiences I have with books, I love them. So I end up ordering far more than I can usually read. And I realized I've ordered a lot of Mircea Eliade's books, in as much as we've used them, for example, in the series on manhood. And I realized I already had this one. And so I started reading it, like right then and there, just pulled it off of the shelf and started reading it. And this book really dives into two main concepts: the concept of sacred space and the concept of sacred time. And so this whole weekend has had me kind of thinking in those terms I was already acquainted with, but of course the book, in focusing on them, really defines them and gets you presented with numerous examples of sacred space and sacred time. Very much tied up with temples and the series that I've been making there. But as I was kind of in that mindset, I also was talking to Sarah a lot about it. Then came out this insight into a week, just the regular 7-day cycle of a week, and how this could be turned or very much seen as a cycle of sacred time that could be lived out. And so that's where we're going to focus today. My wife just jumped on here and made a little post saying new baby lamb just born. Right as I was turning this on, she got word from the boys out in the pasture that her lamb was just being born. So yeah, we're having a nice little lambing season to again kind of have this cycle of a new birth into a new week, which we'll get into as new weeks begin. So that's worth mentioning. But anyway, let's dive into this and explain what is meant by sacred space and sacred time, and why these things might be desirable to understand, but more importantly, to participate in. Because one of the central claims of the book is that, the religious man, especially the traditionally religious man of ancient cultures, was striving to, as much as possible, live within sacred space and sacred time. And inasmuch as he lived in that, his life was more fulfilling. And so here's a way of looking at it in modern terms, is that to live in sacred space or sacred time is to live within spaces, even physical spaces, and time, experience of you flowing through time in a meaningful way. I mean, just transfer sacred for meaningful, and it's essentially the same thing. And so the reason that's so important is because the world, as it's been built into, again, this industrial world focused on work and resources and technology, has largely turned the world into a profane world, right? And profane time where nothing means anything. It's not sacred. Nothing's sacred anymore, right? And so just by that intro, I hope you can kind of see that by understanding these concepts and seeing how you can actually create sacred space and sacred time, this is a way to immediately enhance the meaning of your life, the more that you can create sacred spaces, sacred times, or seek them out. In as much as you can have a part in creating them, but there's also ways that you can seek them out, because they are out there in the world, these spaces of sacred space and these times of sacred time. Okay, so let's start with sacred space. The best way to understand this is to realize that even though I've said that the world has become by and large profane, is to realize that there are things that you experience that let me back up. Let's just put it this way. Even though the world is mostly profane, we are religious beings, and so there are things that unavoidably will present themselves to us as sacred. So an example might be that maybe your grandfather or something gave you a special object growing up, and maybe your grandfather has since passed away. Let's say it's a special cup, right, that is now kept within your cups. And so, when you open up the pantry to look at the cups that are in the pantry, of all the mundane cups, the ones that are replaceable, fungible, etc., there's one there that calls out, that glows with meaning, you could say, and it's that one that the grandfather gave to you. It has a different kind of experience to it, and when you use it for special purposes, or when you use it, you feel a different way, right? And so that cup has become sacred. It is a sacred object, right? And so if you can understand that with a cup, you can understand that with spaces in the world where you feel like that. A lot of people, in searching for meaning, have rediscovered that the natural world is a place of finding these kinds of sacred spaces. There are certain places you can go to, whether it's at the bottom of a certain waterfall or a certain place on a certain mountain you like to go to, where you experience the world in a different way. It is sacred, right? You sometimes, if you're too scientifically minded, you say, well, this is just my psychology acting like this. I'm having this experience because I'm evolutionarily primed in some way to experience. We can try to explain it away, but regardless, you are experiencing that space as different from the 7-Eleven down the street, or when you go into the supermarket, which largely you experience as more profane, mundane, everyday spaces, right? And so there's places in nature like that, and obviously hopefully you've had buildings that are experienced like that. Maybe a special place on a college campus where you've been. Could be a religious building. Of course, religious buildings were meant to be sacred spaces. We'll get into that. But I'm just trying to give examples that are even outside of religion, that even in our profane world, spaces present themselves as sacred. I bring in sports a lot, and oftentimes Lyra's wants something, I guess, but I bring in sports a lot, and sports is a good one because you'll see a lot of the biggest fans and stuff treat the shrine, the stadium, as a sacred space, and there's certain places in that sacred space that are more sacred, or maybe a trophy room or something where the objects have become sacred, right? All examples to just show how there are certain things that shine forth as more meaningful and sacred as compared to others. And so if in the past, and now if you want to, even today, you can try to fill your life more with those types of objects and spaces than not, right? Because and the desirability of that is to be in the presence of those sacred objects, to be using them, or in the presence of a sacred space. You feel more holy. You feel, you could say, more connected to the divine in these kinds of places. And so a big endeavor or a task of when oftentimes people are talking about re-enchanting the world, that's a phrase I really like, the notion of re-enchanting the world or sanctifying the world, was to figure out ways to make more and more of the world into those types of spaces, and more objects in the world into those types of objects. Okay? And you're like, well, how could you possibly do that? Well, the way that you do that is that you actually can participate in the creation of these kinds of sacred spaces in the world. And in doing that, you participate in kind of the central, most powerful thing that the gods have ever done in religions, and that is the act of creation. Okay, and so you can actually create something in a way that you set it apart as special and sacred, and you orient your life around it. Okay, and so examples of how things like that were done in the past is that when founding a city, for example, or a town or village, the central thing that they would do, the first thing was first to decide where to place it, and that would oftentimes it'd have to be a space of significance to begin with, kind of already in a sacred setting, maybe like at a crossroads of two roads, that has a place of significance. And so you might decide, okay, this crossroads of these two significant places is going to be the center of our new village. And so you designate that very center crossroads space as the central space. And in doing that, it's like you create this axis, this center around which now the village now has a meaning. And everything builds out from that central space, and that's probably where you're going to construct the most central things to who you are as a village. Usually your church and your government buildings and whatnot, right there in the center. And then you build yourself out, and your culture is defined out in relation to that central space. And if you've been watching the video, the series on temples, this is exactly the concept of a temple or a shrine. It's an orientation point to now say, okay, here is the center of the world. And so if you've ever heard of a lot of shrines in the world, take Jerusalem, for example, as kind of the quintessential example, are referred to and understood by many peoples as the center of the world. And it's kind of funny, of course, because you find out some other culture called their sacred city the center of the world. And then you find North American Indian tribes who also define something else as the center of the world. So you're like, oh, silly. They're all saying it's the center of the world, and as it turns out, it's all, in our modern perspective, it's all relative, and you couldn't have 5 centers at one place, and there's really no center. But you have to get back into the mindset of what a world is. When we think of world, we oftentimes think planet, right? And that in this more kind of ancient religious sense is not what a world is. The world is, this arena that you experience, right, in your consciousness. The things around you that you understand and comprehend and help you make sense of life. And so you can see how if you're founding a village in which all your daily activities and all your meaning, both your worship of gods, your daily activities, your definition of your trade, your family and your family relations, they're all going to be there. So that's your world, right? And so to establish the center of a village and a place where people are now going to build out from really is, that's how you can see why it is the center of a world, and that becomes the most sacred space of the village by which everybody can orient themselves as kind of how far they're getting away from the center. And then oftentimes, you even have walls and whatnot, and the way that the conception usually goes, and this is exactly how it works in temples and cathedrals and things, is that outside of those walls are generally seen as not the world, right? That's out the you could say the profane, chaotic space, and who lives, outside of that known ordered space that you've now created. Of course, it's the barbarians, the monsters. Eventually you'll get to the ocean, and in there is big. Kind of primordial dragon type monsters in the ocean that can represent chaos. But if you can see this as a map of meaning, then you understand why something's seen as the center of the world, and why, like other people outside of that of the bounds of that central world that has been created, would be seen as not of that world, right? Aliens in for all intents and purposes. Okay. All right. So if you can understand how that's done, well, now let's try to get and say, how could you actually start creating that kind of sacred space in your life? Well, the very cool concept that Eliade brings out is that just as people saw the founding of a village or something as the creation of a world, and that's a word I forgot to bring out. See how in founding and posting that pillar and building that central shrine that would oftentimes be put there at the center of the village or whatnot, they are creating, participating in the creation of the world. Well, take that same notion and say, what happens when you found or create your home or house? It's the very same thing. And you find in so many cultures that the way that they would build their houses would oftentimes have kind of either a central pole, a central axis, or like a central open space. Like if you can imagine a yurt, could have like a central pole in that tent, or a central hole, by which the smoke would go out. And so in founding your own home, you're actually founding another center of the world, and it even refer to that as such. And so kind of a cool example is that when founding a home, they'd even have a special mason or something come who would drive a stake down where the home's going to be. And the concept was it was driving it down kind of into the underworld or into the chaotic space, and fixing and driving it into the chaotic monster that usually lives down there, the dragon. Because once you fix that dragon, if you can imagine, like the dragon lives out in chaotic space. Well, once you kind of conquer that or put a spear into it, it's now not this slithery creature that can be anything, move anywhere, be all chaotic, but it has to be fixed in one space now, right? So it's like you fix down an axis into the ground, into the chaos, and now you're building a little order right there, and it's going to be your little world. And so that little axis of your home becomes your most little sacred space. And oftentimes the most sacred things were done, right, maybe most sacred offerings to the gods or something like that was done at that axis, and you orient your life around that central axis of your home. So is that still possible today? Well, I would like to posit that it is. If you start seeing, so that's the place I would start, is start looking at your home, your dwelling place right now, wherever it may be, even if it's a flat or an apartment or wherever it may be. Say, hey, if you haven't already, maybe some of you are already doing this, say, this is going to be the center. I'm going to start founding a sacred space right here in my home. and build out from this sacred space. And you can kind of look at your home and define what would be your most central sacred space in your home. I've kind of talked about how for me it might be my bedroom that I build out of. This is kind of the most central part of my home, and this and even the most sacred shrine within this 80 acres of mission top that we have here. And so I need to start by essentially doing the Jordan Peterson thing of cleaning my room, but in a more let's up the game a little bit and turn this into a sacred space of meaning. This room where you want to dwell, and everything around, whether it's the books that you have, the things on the wall, the objects around you, you fill that with meaning, and they're the ways that you inhabit now a symbolic world of meaning by which you can orient your life as to what's important. So you make sure you have, if there are books in your life that you consider sacred, right, that are those kind of sacred texts, whether it is literal kind of scripture or ones that you've encountered in your life that have formed you, that have defined you, well, you'd want to make sure they would be there in that sacred kind of space of a room, right? And you can do that with other objects, but everything that you build, every material that you allow into your sacred space, every object should have some sort of meaning that you put into it. From your bed that you have and the coverings that you put on your bed, you should think things through and imbue things, find things that have those kinds of sacred qualities to them, and then you're building out. Now you've built in the world this little space around you, by which you can now dwell in a greater context of meaning and beauty and sacredness. And so, if we can start with that, then we're going to get this is all leading to the week. Don't think that we've just gone completely off course here, but I do that to just kind of give you this practical example of how you can start re-enchanting the world in terms of a space, and then we'll move over to time. The other thing that I failed to mention in this whole thing of defining what sacred space is that in addition to being like a center place by which you orient yourself, this axis that's laid down is always seen also as kind of basically a connection point to the gods. Okay, and when you put down that axis kind of central point, which you define as your center of your world, then right there you're doing what the gods always do in the mythical stories, which is create the world, right? So you are literally participating in the creation of a more sacred world around you in tandem with the gods, and you're making this connection point by which you can kind of live with them, right? So again, if you don't believe in gods or things like that, then turn it into meaning, right? You're giving you're kind of making a portal for the meaningful things of life to come in to your life by this center place. It's the way that you can now communicate with the more enchanted sacred world, rather than just having to live in as you go to work or go to a strip mall or things like that, having to just tolerate profane space in your life. You can go to this place where it's literally a portal into worlds of meaning, if that makes any sense. Okay, so if we understand that, as far as the importance of sacred space and how you can participate in it, then let's now move over to sacred time. And so if the concept is very much the same, is that there are times in your life, there are moments of experience that mark themselves off as very different and distinct from the other moments of your life. For example, it could be a moment when you are in the presence of some other person, like when you have just fallen in love with someone, you found out they love you, or you both care for each other, and when you're in the presence of that person, the world transforms. That you are in a different frame of being at that moment, at a different time, with that person. Anciently, the quintessential examples of sacred time would be the times of festivals, or rituals, right? When you're participating in rituals, which very often the festivals or the rituals would be focused on taking you back to some sort of mythical event that really, for most of the mythical events, kind of laid outside of regular time. It was kind of if by having the festival, maybe it was a festival that celebrated the creation of the world, let's say, and in that festival, the act of creation is actually acted out. Then in that moment, it's as if you're participating in that event anew. So it's not like you're just remembering some event in some historical event in the past. The notion was much more like that event could be lived in and recur again and again. So a festival was a chance for everyone to kind of exit out of regular, just kind of mundane time that flows and whatnot, and enter into this event that could recur again and again. And when you were participating in it, you're actually taking part in the event just as it always was. It's not, again, just a remembering or memorializing of some other event that took place at some other time. It's like, no, it's taking place again at that moment. And that's really important to understand, because in our modern conception of festivals and things like that, we're just kind of remembering something of the past. But it's there fixed in history, like the 4th of July in the United States is remembering this moment in 1776, when the United States declared independence or whatnot. But I find very few people with the notion that, no, we're actually declaring independence again right now as we celebrate the 4th of July. That's something that we've lost. But if you want to fully engage in this notion of sacred time, it's useful to realize that it's possible to enter into a state of time where you're actually participating in, let's say, the patterns of whatever event it is. So let's go to Christmas as kind of probably the central festival of the Western world right now, the one that gets the most attention. As most people see it, they see it as, you are just kind of memorializing, remembering Christ's birth. But if you wanted to really engage with the notion of sacred time, then what you would do is actually say that I am not just remembering Christ's birth, I am participating in the story of Christ's birth. And that's why, like, our family has really latched onto this concept of the liturgical year, which if you are Catholic or Orthodox or some of the traditions is something you're already familiar with, but what wasn't as much to us, of this notion of living through the story, which is why you have Advent and you start entering into the story and the events. And you're supposed to, if you're doing it in the most potent way, kind of be living through the story as you go through, leading up to the actual culminating event, the birth of Christ, where you're participating in that event. And then even after that, of course, there's kind of there's waning events, you could say, like the ocean kind of, it all leads up to a climax and then kind of fades away. And there's other events, such as the Magi or the wise men coming and things like that after the birth that you also participate in. And in that whole time, in as much as you're participating in that, it becomes sacred time, meaningful time. You see how sacred and meaning can kind of be interchanged in this. And so there's that notion of living through something that has importance. Whereas most days you kind of just feel like you're going out there, you have to do your work, you're just doing the stuff to what? To pay the bills, to make sure you've got a house over your head and whatnot. To enter into sacred time is to have the time be imbued with so much more context of meaning. And when you're participating in these sacred times, usually it's also the concept of literally being in the presence of divine beings, as you participate in these kind of mythical divine events. All right. Okay, so what else to mention about that? One thing to see is that in as much as we see time, our modern concept of time is more time as just flowing, in this arrow of time. It's mundane time. Nothing's, the world in a purely scientific sense, everything is not filled with meaning, and time just kind of is flowing through that arrow of time. But if you'll notice that with this sacred time, the time instead is cyclical. Okay, and so it can repeat itself again and again, and that we'll get to this symbol of the, I'm not even sure how to say it exactly, but the Ouroboros that I put here on the thumbnail of this dragon eating its own tail. This is an extremely ancient symbol that has been used all over the world. But anyway, get that symbol in your head and see that it's a notion of time that is cyclical, that's always both kind of expiring out of itself, but also regenerating at the same time. It's being eaten. At the one time it's eating, but at the same time regenerating at the same time. So all of these events, whether that you're participating in, when you're participating in a ritual or a festival, you're, in as much as you're participating in the original event, again, it's like that event has cycled around again. It has recurred. And so it's a different kind of notion of time from the way that we usually see time. Okay, so if that makes any sense, and again, feel free to, if this isn't making sense, if you need any more clarification on any of these things, this is very much newer ways of talking about things to me that, again, I've just been doing since over this weekend. So if it's not landing, if it's not clear, feel free to let me know if something isn't making sense, or if this already is, maybe you feel as if this has already been covered in different ways in the presentations that have been made, and it's we can kind of hurry through these notions of time and space. Just let me know. Any feedback is always appreciated. But let's jump now into seeing the whole year. Many cultures oftentimes saw the whole year as kind of a cycle of sacred time. And this one, there's a sense of intuitiveness to seeing the year as a cycle of sacred time as we lay it out, that you'll see we still have somewhat with us. Again, regardless of the fact that we've come to see things like the New Year, celebration of the New Year as kind of a non-religious celebration for much of the Western world, you'll see that we still nonetheless participate in this more cyclical, renewing view of the world. Okay, so I think the best way to see this concept of the year as a sacred time is to consider how some North American tribes saw the year itself. Okay, so like the time frame of the year as the world. You're like, does that make sense to see a period of time as the world itself? Okay. But yeah, think about that again, because if you consider how every year goes through this pattern of birth, you could say, even if you just think of it ecologically in terms of the seasons, there is this time in the spring of everything was dead, but there is this spark of life, and everything comes into life. It grows. It's creation all around you. And then, of course, you get into a time of abundance and harvest and in eating the fruits of the land. Then things start to decay, and then you go into a time of death where everything dies again and goes dormant and whatnot. And that leads you right into that space of the end of the year and the beginning of a new year. So if you see how like that, see that as a grand cycle of sacred time, you could see how like that could be why you would see that as the entire world, because that is how the world kind of presents itself, as just an ongoing repeating pattern of creation, then death, and then recreation, right? And so the cool thing that you see these cultures do is that as they saw, the whole year as kind of the world, then that meant that the world every year was being absolutely like recreated. So the world would end every year, and the world would begin again every year. And again, to our minds, we think, well, that's just a metaphor, right? Again, to get back into the concept of sacred time, you have to try to imagine seeing that the world actually did end every year. Like the world was there and now it died. It's gone, forever. And now, but you're in luck because a new world has just begun. Okay, and so let me read a little passage. Just oftentimes these authors say things so much better than I can. Okay, the meaning of this periodical retrogression of the world into a chaotic modality was this. All the sins of the year, everything that time had soiled and worn, was annihilated in the physical sense of the word. By symbolically participating in the annihilation and recreation of the world, man too was created anew. He was reborn, for he began a new life. With each new year, man felt freer and purer, for he was delivered from the burden of his sins and failings. He had reintegrated the fabulous time of creation, hence a sacred and strong time. Sacred because transfigured by the presence of the gods, strong because it was the time that belonged only to the most gigantic creation ever accomplished, that of the universe. Okay, so inasmuch as you saw that the world was ending and then beginning with every new year, that meant that you, as a person, were also ending and beginning along with that world. Your old self was, breaking down and dying, and so with the beginning of the new world, you have this sense of new creation. You're actually participating once again, kind of like you did in founding a home. You're participating in that central, most powerful act of the gods, which is the bringing creation or the universe into being. And so you start off the world, a new creature, free from your mistakes, from your sins of the last year. And so, look at our New Year's, the way that we treat the New Year, and that is how people still live this out here millennia later, right? We kind of see this opportunity as a time of leaving behind old habits and things. You've got a fresh start. You've got your resolutions. That's where most people's, your goals and your resolutions along with the new world. Well, that is, how they saw things, but again, in a much more intense way. And so just to read a little bit more about that creation along with the gods. It's easy to understand why the memory of the marvelous time haunted religious man, why he periodically sought to return to it. In illo tempore, the gods had displayed their greatest powers. The cosmogony, that's the creation of the world, or the cosmos, is the supreme divine manifestation, the paradigmatic act of strength, superabundance, and creativity. Religious man thirsts for the real. By every means at his disposal, he seeks to reside at the very source of primordial reality when the world was in statu nascendi. I'm not sure what all his Latin terms mean. Hopefully some of you that might have taken some Latin can, get a little bit more out of those. You get the sense of it, from what he's saying. So, there's very much this sense that in as much as you're part of the world and in as much as you're living through these cycles, you get to participate with the gods in this. So you could see why this would, especially in that time of the end of the world into the new world, would be an especially sacred time, because it's like you are there with the gods, again, participating as the world is recreated, as you get this new sense of creation. And so many peoples would actually, again, live this out, act this out in a way that was like acting out the mythical, the mythical event. So the Mesopotamians would play out this creation of the world, where they'd have people dress up, and in their creation myth, which you've probably, any of you that follow Jordan Peterson have probably heard this a number of times by now. But their creation myth had a primordial, dragon type monster that was called Tiamat, and this female dragon that was kind of the dragon of chaos, because that's how all these creation myths, even in the Bible, everything starts with a kind of chaotic darkness, right? A potential or a chaos or things out of order. So that was the being at first, and then there was this battle with this god Marduk, who conquered Tiamat and cut Tiamat up and made the world from her pieces, which again makes sense if you see, the dragon as kind of potential and chaos, unorganized things. Unorganized things have to be divided up and kind of put together in order to make an organized world. And that goes back to that establishing a home and putting a stake in the ground that, again, kills that dragon of chaos there in order to found your little world right there at your house. So they would actually act it out in a big ritual, and in that, again, participate in that primordial event. Not just remember it, but actually live it out, participate in it. And in as much as you're participating in it, you're participating, with Marduk there. You are identifying with him, you're identifying with creation, etc. And I know there was even a big part that the king at the time there in Mesopotamia would play to in all this ritual as well, which we could hopefully get a more detail at a different time. But one more thing to add to this is that at these end of the year cycles, in as much as it is a death at the end of the year that you're living out, the death of the world, it was also a time of breakdown. Let's see, it talks about Saturnalia. Okay, so the abolition of profane past time was accomplished by rituals that signified a sort of end of the world, the extinction of fires, the return of souls of the dead. Remember, in ancient ways, the death is always associated with dissolution, right? And so, of course, at the death of the world, then it's the dead souls that have turned into dust and become dead. They're going to be there more present at the end of the year. Social confusion of the type exemplified by the Saturnalia, erotic license, orgies, and so on symbolize the retrogression of the cosmos into chaos. On the last day of the year, the universe was dissolved in the primordial waters. The marine monster Tiamat, which we were just talking about, symbol of darkness, of the formless, the manifested, revived, and once again threatened. So it's like, that's the thing about these myths, is that they would recur, right? So Tiamat, she wasn't destroyed forever. She actually came back right there at the end of the world. And then it says the world that had existed for a whole year really disappeared. Since Tiamat was again present, the cosmos was annulled, and Marduk was obliged to create it once again after having once again conquered Tiamat. So that's important to see, as we're going to finally then jump into how we all apply this down to a week, which maybe some of you are now anticipating how this all comes down into the cycle of a week. But it's important to see there that, of course, if you're actually acting out and living in this pattern of meaning, at the end of the world, it would make sense that in places there would be a breakdown of kind of rules, of, like it says, of sexual license, of categories. And so in pointing that out, of kind of how the year goes through this cycle of creation, of formation, and then things start to break down, leading to an ultimate death of the world and a coming in of chaos, and then a refounding of the world. Realize how, for years now, a lot of people have been feeling like that's happening again right now, right? That we're at the end of something. I think a lot of people's conceptions, no longer willing to think, well, we're at the end of the world and like everything's going to be destroyed and everyone's going to die. I don't think most people feel that, although that's always a possibility because of nuclear weapons and whatnot. But a lot of people feel today like we're at the end of a world. And why? Because it's fitting into this pattern where all sorts of things are breaking down. The order of the world is breaking down. There are more and more exceptions, that we're trying to include and find every exception, break down all the regular categories to try to include all things. So there's this fracturing and breakdown of the world. And of course that would happen at the death of a world in preparation for some new spark, some new world, some new little light to begin out of that death. But it's important to realize that in the general cycles of the world, even the ecological cycle, that breakdown has to occur. And it's in a lot of ways not very pretty. It can be kind of an ugly or painful breakdown. And that's certainly what a lot of people are experiencing today in society in order for something new, a new cycle to begin and be birthed. So I just wanted to point that out. Okay, now finally we get to, after, this is all what I was digesting, thinking about here and through this weekend, and especially having given that presentation on Friday with my wife about the family council. This was all in my mind, and I realized, something that I already knew in a lot of degrees. This will be nothing new to you, but just incredibly new possibility, let's say, in creating sacred time in our own lives. And that is by seeing the 7-day week as a cycle very much like we just described of the year, of the creation of a world and then the end of a world. And in many ways, you're probably going to say, yeah, I already lived this out to this degree, but now understanding it, maybe I can live it out to a fuller degree, right? Because as most people live out the week, of course, there are these days of kind of work and putting together the world. You could say the week begins and it's kind of a newly created week, and there's that feeling of refreshment, kind of a new start. You're getting back into the regular act of work and creation, you could say. Let's say there's pretty typically kind of 6 days, or at least 5 now, days of kind of regular creation of the week, where we try to order things and hold things together and be into our most ingrained patterns of life, right? And then as things have developed in the Western world, we kind of have 2 days that are different, right? Particularly, probably, at least for me, it starts Friday evening, as work usually ends on Friday and we're moving into Friday evening. And what happens on Friday evening, right? There kind of is, to me, a sense of breakdown. Like, you can get out of the regular patterns. You can do new things. That's when my wife and I go on a date. We eat different foods we don't eat during the week. We might break some rules of going to bed a little bit later than we had before. And that leads into Saturday, which is already, again, kind of this day of breakdown, of doing the things that you don't otherwise get to do. A lot of people treat it as a day of recreation, and think of that word, recreation, but it's more a day of breakdown, right? Breaking out of the patterns. A lot of people are drinking over the weekend. Why? Because look at the symbolic import of that. You're taking yourself and putting yourself out of your regular mind state, your world. You break down your world into a different type of experience of the world when you're drinking. So people are doing that more on the weekends, right? And so if anything was the revelation to me, was this act of creation. I've kind of had this notion in my mind for a long time, but when does the new week then begin? And here's where, in our world of pluralities and so many ways of looking at things, you'll just kind of have to define it for yourself. But myself being a Christian, the answer is, the way that it's come out in Christianity, is that Sunday presents itself as the first day of the week, or at least it's supposed to. But see, even in my mind, even though I knew it's supposed to be the first day of the week, I think most of us still think of Sunday as the weekend. It's part of this general package of Friday evening, Saturday, and Sunday, which is just kind of this time where you don't have to work, and it's part of the weekend, right? But the more I thought about this pattern of a world being created, establishing itself in like 6 days of creation, you could say, well, then this 7th day, you can see as 2 different things. It can be presented as a day of rest, like it is there in Genesis, but when you add in the fact that the resurrection happens on this Sunday, and we kind of moved, Christians after a couple hundred years in early Christianity moved the holy day to that day of emerging from the tomb, then you can see how, at least in the Christian conception, the most appropriate thing is to see Sunday as the first day of the week where things are created anew. It's a fresh start, right? And so that very much fell into realizing like why we have our family council, for example, on a Sunday. The family council for us is the way that we create our world, again, each week. Like, that's literally what we are doing every week, is we're creating the world as a family. We have to order things. There is a sense that we've talked a little bit about breakdown and renewal, but we're ordering our lives again for the week. And if we don't do it, the whole week passes by and there's this feeling of our world is kind of broken that week, So again, we're literally creating or participating in a sacred time. That family council is a sacred time, in as much as we've talked about it like this, right? But what else happens on a Sunday for a Christian, for example? And this could, again, if you're not Christian, at least appreciate the meaning, the patterns of meaning found within the acts. Where, like for us, when the central act that we go and do at our worship services with our church is that we go and we eat the bread and the wine. In our church, it's actually water. Long story why, but just it's the same thing as the bread and the wine that is participated in so many churches. And that whole thing, I mean, first of all, there's kind of this, I love how Jonathan Pageau points out there's a scandal in what you're doing. Like you are literally doing a pattern of cannibalism, right? It's a notion of a sacrifice has been done, a human sacrifice, which is like your God was sacrificed in Jesus. He died, right? And Saturday was the day he lay in the tomb in the story. But in this, day, he's sacrificed, and you are eating him, right? You're taking him into yourself. But it's taking this, horrible thing, human sacrifice, which has occurred, all throughout humanity, and totally flipping the meaning into like a triumph, right? And you connecting yourself with this highest God, because this God overcame death. He died, but he was reborn, right? And so you see that this notion of death on Saturday goes into, which, this guy was saying Saturnalia associated with kind of the death and in the world. I'm kind of wondering if there's something associated with the god, Saturn and maybe some sort of death and whatnot on Saturday, leading into Sunday, where you have, again, resurrection, rebirth, recreation of the world. And so, on Sunday, instead of seeing it as just like a day of more breakdown, like a lot of people do, they just go and recreate or thing like that. Here's the day that you can use to, like it was described in here, to see you are a new person that day. Like that's the whole idea of the the process of taking the bread and the wine and the communion or whatnot. There's also this sense of a forgiveness of past errors and you're becoming a new creature, right? A new creation for the week. And there you start out fresh, renewed. You're a new person. The old person there, it's gone. That's where most of Christianity have these very strong notions of forgiveness. That all those things, your sins, as long as you're in this basic process, they're all gone. You are a new person, and the guilt and the errors of all those things can be left there in the destructed, dead past, if you will. So anyway, seeing the week like that, and understanding the notion of this sacred time and the way that, in as much as you are in sacred time, your life is filled with more meaning, you can now start living through this pattern of a week, of a 7-day week, and already, make your life more, have that time, that cycle, be a cycle of sacred time. And like we said at the beginning of this presentation, in as much as you're in sacred space or sacred time, your life does feel more meaningful. And the more meaning you feel, the more, life is filled with that, the joy and the satisfaction that comes from knowing that your life actually matters for something. All right. The one thing that I would put on there is that, in the past, the most ancient societies, in as much as they saw time as cyclical like this, would actually see that cycle as kind of a prison, right? Because if you're only in a cycle all the time, it's just a recurrence, an eternal recurrence of things. But that's where, I'm not sure if it's exactly with the Jews or whatnot, but the Hebrew conception of a progress towards something, to a progress towards a promised land, I think, started coming into the picture, where this notion of cyclical time was combined with the notion of progress. And that's where I like to place things today. So as you see this 7-day week, of course, you're not looking to just be recreated and die with nothing coming of it, right? This cycle that you're stuck in. Instead, this cycle of death and recreation, should much more be seen as a cycle. I like to see it as kind of a spiral staircase, right? You're in a cycle, but the whole idea of it is that you're in a cycle of death, or of birth, of breakdown, and death, and then rebirth, in a way that with each rebirth you're trying to be reborn as something better, right? And once again, in the Christian conception, or the Judeo-Christian, it's very much that notion of you started in paradise with a beautiful creation in paradise. You make heirs. You participate in the tree of knowledge and things, and in that course of living life and learning and growing, you make heirs in that, and then you're trying to get back, reborn back to the mountain, but as a new, more progressed creature, right? You're not just trying to get back to the starting point. You're trying to get somewhere, come back to the mountain, as it were, the sacred mountain with God, having progressed and become a more advanced, developed creature, as it were. And so, inasmuch as that happens, then and you participate in that cycle of sacred time. I'm just going to finish kind of with some passages here from Eliade that show you, kind of give you the concept that to do that puts you in contact with the gods. You get to live with the gods in as much as you're living out this sacred mythical cycle with them. And again, if you don't like the gods, see it as you get to live out with the principles of meaning, right? The ideals of meaning around you as you put yourself more in contact with them. Okay, let me just make sure I'm starting in the most effective place here. Okay, this primordial situation is not historical. So this is talking about that participation in creation. It is not calculable chronologically. So it's not the same thing as historical time. What is involved is a mythical anteriority, the time of origin, what took place in the beginning, in principio. Now, what took place in the beginning was this. The divine or semi-divine beings were active on earth, hence the nostalgia for origins is equivalent to a religious nostalgia. Man desires to recover the active presence of the gods. He also desires to live in the world as it came from the Creator's hands, fresh, pure, and strong. It is the nostalgia for the perfection of beginnings that chiefly explains the periodical return in illo tempore. In Christian terms, it could be called a nostalgia for paradise, although on the level of primitive cultures, the religious and ideological context is entirely different from that of Judeo-Christianity. But the mythical time whose reactualization is periodically attempted is a time sanctified by the divine presence. And we may say that the desire to live in the divine presence and in a perfect world, perfect because newly born, corresponds to the nostalgia for a paradisal situation. So, yeah, even outside the Christian conception, there's this concept of wanting to return to a pristine state, right? And in as much as you are in that pristine state, that's the new state of creation where the gods are most present. You could say that's in the Christian conception, that's being there in the paradise, walking, talking with God in the paradise before you're cast out of it. So, a lot of people see that as their entire life. Maybe you started there sometime like in childhood, right? And then you're cast out of that by the time you're a teenager, and now you're trying to get back to that. But the thing that I think is groundbreaking for me is if you see that you can do that every week, then you collapse down that cycle into something that can take place on a weekly basis, where on a weekly basis you're trying to get back, you can get back to that state of new creation where the gods are most present there. Okay, one more passage and we'll be wrapped up. This one, okay, so a little background on this one. He brings up how you could say that to be in this kind of cycle, again, looks as something very primitive. He says that like kind of man, the religious man of the past was stuck in this cycle, you could say, and it was kind of a not good thing. It says a modern psychologist would be tempted to interpret such an attitude as anxiety before the danger of the new. So he's saying, like, you don't want to have a new world or new situations. Rather, you want to just be stuck in this recurring cycle that is comfortable, something like that. Refusal to assume responsibility for a genuine historical presence. Nostalgia for a situation that is paradisal precisely because it is embryonic, insufficiently detached from nature. That problem is too complex to be discussed here. In any case, it lies outside the field of our investigation, for in the last analysis, it implies the problem of the opposition between pre-modern and modern man. Okay, so just know that's the context. Now, here's the good stuff. On the contrary, as we have seen and shall see again, this conception assumes immense responsibilities. For example, that of collaborating in the creation of the cosmos, or of creating his own world, or of ensuring the life of plants and animals, and so on. So somebody that takes on this type of notion of being in this cycle actually is not trying to avoid the responsibility of kind of living in history as it proceeds, but is taking on great responsibility in so much as they are participating in the creation of the world right where they are around them. But it is a different kind of responsibility from those that to us moderns appear to be only genuine and valid responsibilities. It is a responsibility on the cosmic plane, in contradistinction to the moral, social, or historical responsibilities that are alone regarded as valid in modern civilizations. From the point of view of profane existence, man feels no responsibility except to himself and to society. So that would be kind of the man of profane time. You know, we know what we feel in our regular Western life. We feel these basic responsibilities to kind of make our life good and, you know, be a decent participator in society. But he's saying it's something completely different for this type of religious person. It says, for him, the universe does not properly constitute a cosmos, that is, a living and articulated entity. It's still talking about the material person, the profane person living in a profane world. For him, the universe does not properly constitute a cosmos, that is, a living and articulated unity. It is simply the sum of the material reserves and physical energies of the planet. And the great concern of modern man is to avoid stupidly exhausting the economic resources of the globe. But existentially, the primitive always puts himself in a cosmic context. His personal experience lacks neither genuineness nor depth, but the fact that it is expressed in a language unfamiliar to us makes it appear spurious or infantile to modern eyes. So yeah, the contrast between kind of the modern man who looks at the world as just kind of this landscape of resources which we should extract, and hopefully we do it smartly enough to not pollute too much that we can just achieve our purposes, is a completely different arena, you could say, from the religious man, is what Eliade calls him. I'm going to say the man of meaning, who tries to live in a world, a cosmos, where everything has much more significance, where you're participating in greater patterns of meaning. You know, I think the best language is you are living amongst the gods, you know, the divine beings, these different levels of being, another way that Pajot puts it, where the arena is filled with much more significance and unity, all connected, you know, into itself in patterns of meaning, than just that kind of straight line flat world. That's another way of putting kind of the mundane, regular world, the flat world of just kind of science and making a profit and just trying to kind of, get as much money into your bank account. That is a framework of meaning. It's just a flat, shallow one, right? To revert to our immediate subject, we have no warrant for interpreting periodic return to the sacred time of origin as a rejection of the real world and an escape into dream and imagination. On the contrary, it seems to us that here again we can discern the ontological obsession to which we have referred, and which, moreover, can be considered an essential characteristic of the man of the primitive and archaic societies. For to wish to reintegrate the time of origin is also to wish to return to the presence of the gods, to recover the strong, fresh, pure world that existed in illo tempore. It is at once thirst for the sacred and nostalgia for being. And I think that's a great line. It's at once thirst for the sacred, and nostalgia for being. On the existential plane, this experience finds expression in the certainty that life can be periodically begun over again with a maximum of good fortune. Indeed, it is not only an optimistic vision of existence, but a total cleaving to being. By all his behavior, religious man proclaims that he believes only in being, and that his participation in being is assured him by the primordial revelation of which he is the guardian. The sum total of primordial revelations is constituted by his myths. Okay, so that's where I wanted to end today with this, is just hopefully what we built today is some concrete examples of how us who live predominantly in the profane world and in profane time, the regular world that we all experience, which, has some good aspects to it. There's an abundance of food, an abundance of pleasures, an abundance of material wealth, you could say. But, so many people have felt that it is lacking meaning. It is lacking significance. That the framework that is presented to us, again, in just the regular kind of go to school, work, accumulate material possessions, have pleasures, as much pleasure and toys and amusement as you can, and then die, is just not enough. It's not as meaningful of an arena to which gives the kind of satisfaction in life that most people want. So one answer is to look back to what Eliade calls, he's saying primitive man. And I think that's a disservice because, at least in today's terms, that's kind of pejorative to say that something's primitive. Rather, I look back at that mode of being, you could say, this notion of being in these cycles of meaning, these cycles that get you dwelling in the presence of the gods, as it were, right? And attached to the world in a much more profound way, interacting with it. That's not primitive at all. It's something that we lost. You could even call it psychotechnologies. Like this week, as we presented it, this 7-day week, you could say is a technology of meaning in our minds, a psychotechnology that you can live out and generate more meaning in this cycle of birth, living, renewal and death, and rebirth. That could be seen very much as technology. And so these entering into those frames of meaning and being, in as much as they enhance our lives, again, I see as something very much like a technology that we have lost in our flattening of the world and our focusing on just the physical and the material in it. So hopefully by just presenting the concept of sacred space and some ideas there, and now this concept of sacred time in the context of just the week, you can see how you could start living much more in this cycle of meaning. And then you learn to master the cycle, even because in as much as the cycle includes death and breakdown, well, of course here when we enter into Saturdays and Fridays, we don't want, as it talked about these old festivals, sexual license and orgies and stuff going on in my family and stuff like that, obviously. But in the breakdown, we can try to do it in the most productive way. For example, our family spent this Saturday, this time of breakdown out of the patterns, saying, okay, well, let's do something different from everyday life, but something that actually helps all of us. So as mundane as this sounds, we moved this giant pile of straw that had been kind of sitting there ugly in our house, by our house, to another place. And it took several hours and it was hard and whatnot, but it was different. It did renew us in terms of our body. We were tired after it, but it was an activity that we all did together. And at the end of the day, we felt tired, but renewed in the sense that it gave a new beginning to our landscape, to our lives, and we did it all together. It's a lot better than breaking down and sexual license and all that, if that makes any sense, right? So I'm just trying to say that once you understand these cycles, that act of moving that hay was something very different and kind of a breakdown for our family because it was not part of our regular routine was what I'm trying to say. But in as much as we understand this cycle of breakdown, we use that time of doing different things and breaking down our patterns in order to actually do something productive rather than to just do something unproductive. Of course, you don't always have to be working in that time of breakdown. I think recreation is a good thing, and breaking out of our regular patterns, going into nature, that's another way that nature just breaks you down, right? Breaks down your mental patterns, breaks down your emotional states and things like that, and renews you. That's another good way. And so once you are living in these patterns, you can start mastering them and using them in the ways that do most effectively spiral you up to a greater state of progression. Okay, that's all I had to say about that today, and I'm glad that some of you have put in some comments now. We'll hit those. Anybody else that wants to put in questions or comments, do so now because we're just going to be wrapping up. But thank you. Some new names on here, and that always pleases me to see new people on here. So Evo Kroon, and apologies if I say your name wrong. He says, "I'm not Christian, but love to use Sunday as the first day of the week. Great way to plan, prepare, and reflect." And see, that's great. Even though I am Christian, you were already ahead of me, because even though I've heard my whole life Sunday is the first day of the week, I never treated it that way, or I haven't. And I'm even now still just trying to get myself in the mindset to treat it as the beginning rather than as just kind of my last holding ons to the end of the week, right? And you don't look forward to the beginning of the week, which is Monday, which is that, kind of back to the mundane stuff. But it's so much better, like you describe it, to use Sunday as this time of a beginning, and ordering a setting forth such that Monday becomes, now I know what I'm trying to accomplish as of Monday, the world that I'm creating here as I proceed through the regular week, and everything becomes a lot more meaningful. So I'm glad you have already seen that. So Nick Papp says, "Your videos are amazing, full of wisdom, and a barren wasteland of immorality. Your inspiration." Oh, thank you. And those are very kind words. I'll try to actually live up to them. Wiss says, "Choose your pain, choose your circle." Good words. I'm trying to think the best way to, what those best apply to, but I think that's a good way, at least the way that I'm finding most to apply that is to think of that in the terms of when you come to a time of breakdown, which we all, we have to experience the times of breakdown. That's been one of the major things I've thought about for the last few years. And by the way, this whole cycle of the week, see how it applies just as much to the cycle of the day, right? You wake up in the morning and it's as if you've been created anew. I think the Jews have a prayer that you do right there when you wake up and say thank you for God for restoring my soul to me. So it's like you were dead, you were only slightly conscious there in dreamscape. You wake up, it's the new beginning. You work, it's a new start in the morning. You try to do the most effective things in the morning. You guys have probably noticed that, because as the day wears on, you become less effective, and you get there tonight and everything's breaking down. Why is it so much harder to hang up your clothes at the end of the day? So often I'm just throwing them on the ground because I can't handle even putting my clothes in my closet at the end of the day. And nighttime is, right there before bed is where your patterns are breaking down. You're not as effective in your thinking oftentimes. But in those times of breakdown, there can be, some things that, there is something special to that nighttime pre-bed time that can, in that breakdown, that can come out of that, new possibilities, right? Some of my best conversations are right before bed with my wife and whatnot. And then you go into a death state. So anyway, that's important to point out. Wiss also said, kind of as a follow-up, there will be pain in whatever you do. Better be pain for doing something productive than the pain of result of unproductive action. Yeah. So applying it to what my family was doing, that's where you can kind of try to take these things like breakdowns and find the way to most effectively channel the breakdown into breaking down something good rather than it breaking down something bad, because both kinds of breakdowns can happen, right? You can break down bad habits, bad things in your life, or you could, with that, if you're not wise, break down valuable things that you've built up. So, and either kind is painful. So better to apply that pain oftentimes to the more productive things. So yeah, thanks for that, Wis. All right, well, that's all I had to say about that today. I hope you enjoyed this particular one, and more, I hope you also saw in it the value of the process of how these kinds of things, at least I learn in this way, if that's useful for anybody, how this all came out of targeting a meaningful YouTube channel that then led to a book, that then led to thinking, that then led to, living it out in a sense over the weekend and watching myself live it out. This then leads to me trying to articulate it to it here. And all this now makes it so that hopefully I will be able to live this out to a greater degree. And in as much as that's a pattern of meaning, hopefully that is helpful to you as well. So this is Gary signing off from another day. We'll be back tomorrow. And this week I am getting out, I will get out the video Interstellar that I've been working on for some time, and hopefully it'll be worth the wait. So that will be by the end of the week. All right, goodbye, and hope to see you back next time. This is Gary signing out from Mission Top.